I can't hear myself. It's no good. That sound is no good. The sound is overpowering.
Yeah.
And then I can't.
Paul Simon's quiet anger towards another famous musician actually forced a band to break up. Everyone knew him as the calm, smart songwriter of his generation. But secretly, he judged other musicians very harshly. He believed some of the most famous bands were musical disasters. Let us discover which band he despised so much that he called their work a crime against art. 1. The Rolling Stones.
The Rolling Stones' summer tour may have been sponsored by the American Association of Retired Persons.
For a master craftsman like Paul Simon, listening to the Rolling Stones was likely a painful, if not infuriating, experience. Simon's entire artistic life was lived inside the pristine, controlled environment of the recording studio. This was his laboratory, a place where every single sound was carefully considered, captured, and polished to absolute perfection. He was a man who became a legend among sound engineers for his obsessive patience, famously spending days on end just to capture the perfect echoing sound of a single snare drum hit for his masterpiece, Bridge Over Troubled Water. His songs were like intricate, tiny jewels, with every facet cut with microscopic precision. He layered complex, jazz-influenced chords that other rock musicians wouldn't even know how to play. And he wrote lyrics that were as sophisticated and beautiful as great poetry. He truly believed that this meticulous process, this dedication to perfection, was the only honorable way to create lasting art. Then, he would be forced to hear the sound of the Rolling Stones, and it must have registered to his ears as nothing more than pure, lazy, and unintelligent chaos. Paul Simon absolutely hated the celebrated sloppiness that was at the very core of the Stones' sound. Where millions of fans heard raw, thrilling, and authentic energy, Simon almost certainly heard a band that was too lazy or too untalented to bother tuning their instruments properly. One can easily imagine him listening to a classic Stones track, like Brown Sugar or Honky Tonk Women, and physically cringing. He wouldn't hear a legendary guitar riff. He'd hear a guitarist fumbling through a simple blues scale.
Well, I'd like to sing, but you've got to understand that the problems of doing a show such as the ones you see.
He wouldn't hear the iconic feel of Charlie Watts's drumming. He would hear a drummer who was consistently and maddeningly just a little behind the beat, a kind of rhythmic sloppiness that would have driven a control freak like Simon absolutely insane. He viewed their entire approach to music not as authentic, but as primitive. He hated their reliance on basic, three-chord blues progressions, seeing it as a pathetic crutch for musicians who clearly lacked the musical vocabulary or intellectual curiosity to write a truly interesting or sophisticated melody. The so-called glorious mess that the world loved was, in his brutally honest assessment, just a mess. This hate was born from a place of deep and unwavering intellectual disdain. He looked at the biggest and most beloved rock band in the world and saw a group of amateurs who were being celebrated for everything he stood against. The Stones were praised for their raw power. Simon valued quiet, thoughtful precision. They were loved for their rebellious attitude. Simon valued careful, intelligent construction. He must have been completely and utterly baffled by their incredible, enduring success. How could a band that was so musically unadventurous, so sloppy in their execution, and so reliant on a simple, borrowed formula be held up as musical gods? For Simon, it was like watching a child's crude finger painting being hung in a museum next to a masterpiece by Rembrandt. He hated what they represented. He hated the idea that you could just plug in your instruments, make a loud, messy noise, and be considered a genius. It was a personal and professional insult to his entire life's work. The Rolling Stones were not just a band whose music he disliked, they were the living, breathing, and infuriating proof of a musical world that he simply did not respect. While he dismissed the Stones as nothing more than musically simple primitives, he viewed the most popular band of all time with the cold, calculating, and bitter eye of a direct rival. 2. The Velvet Underground.
You're saying there's an absolute distinction between Lou Reed post-Velvet Underground and Velvet Underground?
I thought I knew what I was saying, but if I listen to you much more, maybe I will.
If Paul Simon's music was like a beautiful, well-kept park, full of detailed and lovely melodies, then the Velvet Underground's music was the loud, screeching sound of a subway train in a dark, dirty tunnel. They didn't just have a different style from Simon. Their entire reason for being seemed to be an attack on everything he believed in. Simon built his songs with the care of a surgeon, believing in melody, harmony, and the power of a perfectly structured tune. Lou Reed and his band, on the other hand, seemed to treat ugly, jarring noise as their main goal. Their music was raw and unsettling. It explored the grim, unpleasant parts of city life with a sound that was purposefully against melody. To Simon, this wasn't just a different kind of music, it was a completely different way of seeing the world, a kind of artistic negativity that he found both strange and deeply offensive. For a short and uncomfortable time, they were on the same record label, which forced their two opposite worlds to get close. Simon remembered their few meetings as being cold and unfriendly. Lou Reed, dressed in leather as the king of downtown cool, acted in a way that Simon hated. He would show up late, always wearing dark sunglasses, and would stand with his arms crossed as if he were getting ready for a fight. Reed's entire attitude seemed to be one of aggressive boredom, a performance of not caring that Simon found completely fake. Simon poured his real, often painful feelings into his songs, so to him, Reed's tough guy attitude felt like a cheap act. Simon believed Reed wasn't showing real feelings. He was just pretending not to have any. It was a pose, and for an artist like Paul Simon, who hated anything fake, it was a major sin. This clash between their two worlds was perfectly captured in two short meetings. The first was a tense encounter where everyone was polite on the surface, but underneath there was a huge gap of misunderstanding. Reed, for his part, openly looked down on Simon's clean and careful style. He once sneered that Simon's work was music for therapists and not the good kind, a put-down that showed his distaste for what he saw as safe, overthought art. The second and final meeting was even more telling. As Simon was in the middle of talking, Lou Reed simply turned around and walked away without saying a word. There was no argument, no shouting. It was something much worse. Total dismissal. That simple act was like Reed's music, abrupt, shocking, and showing no respect for normal, polite conversation. Simon never forgot that moment of disrespect. He learned that anger didn't need to be loud. It could be delivered in a silence that was sharp enough to cut. And Lou Reed had used that silence like a weapon. The Velvet Underground wasn't just a band he didn't like. They represented an entire artistic belief system that he rejected, one where beauty was thrown away for noise, and real emotion was replaced with a sneer. Simon rejected music that felt like a painful pose, but he also couldn't stand music that felt like a painless, perfect performance. 3. The Police.
We formed the band The Police. Is this the first time you attempt to write your own songs?
Oh, no, I've been writing my songs since I was a kid.
On the surface, it looked like Paul Simon and Sting should have been friends. They were both seen as the brainy leaders of their bands, two rock stars who brought a love of words and smart musical ideas to the pop charts. People often talked about them in the same way, as poets who knew how to write a hit song. Both of their bands played with clever rhythms and advanced harmonies. But underneath these similarities, Simon felt a deep and growing annoyance with the lead singer of The Police. This feeling didn't come from being jealous of Sting's success. It came from a major disagreement about what it meant to be a real artist. Whenever someone brought up Sting's name, Simon would get tense. The problem for him was what he saw as Sting's faked sincerity. He felt that Sting was always playing the part of a wise and thoughtful man, instead of actually being one. To Paul Simon, music was a way to talk about your scars. His best songs came from his own doubts, heartbreaks, and the messy, real-life problems that everyone faces. His art was like digging for treasure. He dug into his own painful experiences to find the truths that connected him to everyone else. When he listened to the Police, and later to Sting's solo music, he heard something very different, a performance. It was flawless, smart, and often impressive, but to Simon, it felt rehearsed and unnatural. He saw Sting as someone who had figured out all the right things to do and say, someone who thought so much about his feelings that they no longer felt real. Sting sings like he's solving a riddle for applause. Simon once said to a friend, this comment perfectly summed up his problem. He thought Sting's music was a mental exercise designed to be admired for how clever it was, not an honest cry from the heart meant to be felt.
I like actors who can, when the camera's turned off, can relax.
Yeah.
Because
And she does that?
Acting is too difficult.
This private frustration became a public, though silent, action at a big charity concert in 2002. The event was full of musicians admiring each other and playing together. On stage, Sting, who was always a charming performer, suddenly suggested that he and Simon sing a duet. Two poets, just one microphone, he joked to the happy crowd. Simon, caught in the spotlight, managed to smile politely, but anyone who knew him could see the coldness in his eyes. The duet never took place. The very next day, Simon quietly told his team to turn down any future invitations to work with Sting. The rejection was final and clear, without a single word being spoken between them. Friends said that Simon went back to his hotel room that night and wrote angrily in a notebook. He wasn't writing a song, he was letting out all of his built-up annoyance. This wasn't about his ego, it was about his disappointment. In Sting, Simon saw everything he thought music should not be: controlled, planned, and cleaned up until all the messy human parts were gone. They never talked about it again. And for Paul, that silence said more than any song they could have sung together. He disliked art that felt fake, but he was just as wary of a band who turned rebellion itself into a fake product. 4. The Beatles. The story of Paul Simon's relationship with the Beatles is a quiet and bitter war that was fought on the battlefield of the pop charts, in the minds of critics, and most importantly, inside Simon's own hyper-competitive head. On the surface, of course, Simon has always had to say that he respected their work. In the 1960s, you simply had to. But underneath all the polite and professional praise lay the intense, burning jealousy of a brilliant competitor who secretly and firmly believed that he was better. During the late 1960s, Simon and Garfunkel were one of the very few musical acts on the entire planet who could truly challenge the Beatles for cultural and commercial dominance. While the world was losing its mind over revolutionary albums like Sgt. Pepper, Paul Simon was quietly in the studio, crafting his own intricate, timeless masterpieces like Bookends. This created a fierce rivalry in his mind that became deeply personal. He wasn't just listening to their music as a fan, he was studying his enemy, obsessively searching for any sign of weakness, any mistake, any flaw he could latch onto to reinforce his own sense of superiority. Even his supposed admiration for Paul McCartney, another master of melody, was likely a twisted form of professional envy. He could certainly recognize McCartney's genius for writing a perfect pop song, but it likely ate away at him. This envy drove him to analyze the Beatles' music with a cold, joyless, and surgical precision. He didn't listen to songs like Hey Jude or Let It Be to feel the swell of emotion that the rest of the world felt. He listened to them to dissect them, to take them apart in his head, note by note, to figure out their tricks so he could prove to himself over and over that he could do it better. This joyless process of deconstruction is a clear sign of a man who was deeply haunted by his rival's unbelievable success. He hated that the Beatles were always seen as the undisputed champions, while he was seen as the brilliant challenger. This fueled a desperate need to find flaws in their perfect, shining image. This is why he seemed to focus so obsessively on the eventual and messy collapse of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. As one half of his own famously difficult and bitter duo with Art Garfunkel, Simon felt a kind of smug, "I told you so" satisfaction as he watched the Beatles' creative relationship begin to publicly disintegrate. He could hear the cracks forming in their music long before the general public could even imagine such a thing. He would listen to their later albums, especially the sprawling and disconnected White Album, not with the sadness of a fan, but with the cold, satisfied detachment of a rival watching his enemy's kingdom crumble. He saw it not as a bold artistic statement, but as a messy collection of solo songs, a chaotic document of their inability to get along. He likely sneered at the lack of cohesion, feeling superior because he believed his own artistic vision was purer, more focused, and more intellectually sound. The hate here was not the loud, angry type. It was a quiet, simmering, and deeply held resentment. It was the hate of a brilliant artist who simply could not stand being in anyone else's shadow. He hated their effortless cool. He hated their universal adoration, and he took a cold, grim, professional pleasure in dissecting their inevitable and, in his mind, predictable decline. His intellectual contempt for his biggest rivals was nothing compared to the pure, almost physical disgust he felt for a certain band of smiling, happy-go-lucky boys from the sunny beaches of California. 5. The Beach Boys.
Well, it's the music, obviously. People enjoy the sort of the happy.
Paul Simon's feelings for the Beach Boys began as pure, undiluted hatred, and there is very little evidence to suggest that his profoundly negative opinion ever truly changed. To truly grasp the depth of his loathing for them, you have to transport yourself back to his world in the early 1960s. Paul Simon was a deeply serious young artist, a proud product of the intellectual, poetic, and politically charged folk music scene of Greenwich Village in New York City. His entire existence was dedicated to the pursuit of high art. He was surrounded by other artists who wrote deep, meaningful songs about social injustice, personal alienation, and the most complex struggles of the human condition. His world was a serious one, a place of smoky coffee houses, intense conversations about philosophy, and the deeply held belief that music should have a grand and noble purpose. Then, like a silly cartoon broadcast from another planet, came the sound of the Beach Boys. To Paul Simon, this was not just bad music. It was a cultural disease. He absolutely despised their lyrics with every fiber of his being. He was painstakingly crafting poetic lines like, "Hello darkness, my old friend," and they were cheerily singing about fun, 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 and wanting to be true to your school. To a serious young wordsmith like Simon, this was not just simple or childish, it was an absolute insult to the art of songwriting. He heard their famously complex and beautiful vocal harmonies not as a sign of musical genius, but as a kind of mindless, sugary, and annoying noise. It was the sound of ignorance, a happy soundtrack for a nation that was ignoring its deep and serious problems. He hated everything about them, from their goofy matching striped shirts to their wholesome, squeaky clean, all-American image. He saw them as nothing more than a silly novelty act, a disposable pop culture fad that had absolutely nothing to do with real, lasting art. Even the later, more musically ambitious work of their leader, Brian Wilson, would have done almost nothing to change Simon's fundamental, and deep-seated hatred. While a musical craftsman like Simon could, on a technical level, recognize the skill and studio genius that went into making a landmark album like Pet Sounds, he would have viewed it as a colossal and tragic waste of that genius. In his brutally critical mind, what was the point of building a beautiful, complex, and innovative musical palace if you were just going to fill it with childish and meaningless furniture? It was, to him, like watching a master painter like Rembrandt use all of his incredible talent to paint a picture of a talking mouse. He believed with all his heart that great art required great themes, and he saw absolutely nothing great, important, or meaningful in the Beach Boys' fantasy world of an endless summer. The musical brilliance was rendered completely irrelevant by the profound stupidity of the subject matter. He hated them not just for being simple, but for what he saw as a deep dishonesty. They were selling a glossy, happy lie about an America that he knew was full of darkness, anxiety, and complexity. He hated them for being a distraction from reality, and in the serious world of Paul Simon, there was no greater sin. Was Paul Simon's taste the final word, or did he miss out on greatness? Tell us what you think in the comments. Like this video and subscribe for more.